All right, let's get across those headlines now with Federal Political Editor at the Daily Telegraph, Sky News host, of course, James Morrow. James, IR again dominating the question time, but also the parliamentary time, the negotiating time. There's a lot of work going on with senators. Where's it all up to? Because I watched question time closely. Julie Collins, as I said, I cannot believe she's in cabinet. She is the Minister for Small Business. She failed to answer most of the questions today. She looked completely rattled. Worse than that, I don't think she looked like she's across her brief. Dennis Shanahan, I tell you, he didn't miss. He summed up the plot of Collins pretty brilliantly in the Australian Today. He said she looked like a wildebeest or an antelope crossing a river where Labor knew she was outnumbered by crocodiles. What do you think?
Look, I thought that was a pretty colourful explanation by Dennis Shanahan, but it's not far from the mark. I was there in the press gallery today, Peter, watching her performance here, and it was just amazing because, you know, the coalition brings up the fact that in the regulatory impact statement around the IR legislation, there is an error that puts out by about $6,000 the cost to a medium-sized business. And so, of course, you know, the coalition went and asked questions about this and tried to hold her to account. Well, I tell you what, the protection racket swung into high gear, and, you know, objections, procedural this, procedural that. She's the Minister for Small Business, so she can't answer a question about medium-sized businesses. You wouldn't have believed, and well, you did because you watched it, but you see the number of ways that they tried to avoid her even coming close to having to answer the question. This is the third or fourth mistake she's had in the last 5 or 6 days. She's looking very accident-prone, and, you know, one coalition source said to me that she is on that front bench of Labor, the weakest link.
Yeah, I looked at the issue with the RIS, regulatory impact statement. I had a look at the numbers. There is an addition problem. It just doesn't add up. Now, you know, legislation's that big. There will be errors in it. There's no doubt about that. It's why you often see things amended in the Senate. But why on earth she didn't get to the dispatch box and say, yeah, there's a mistake, okay, there's an error? Table something else in terms of an update to the RIS, or have that happen in the Senate. I think the bill's in the Senate now. But the game of obfuscation just made everybody then hone in on the fact that there was a mistake and she wasn't taking responsibility for it. I just think she should have dropped that and moved on, but she didn't. And now we're all talking about how incompetent she looks. Talk to me about Phil Lowe. His comments about energy, very strong today.
Yeah, so Phil Lowe has come out and said, you know, his Reserve Bank chair, said that the problem with the renewable transition is that this is going to be part of the inflationary costs that are going to make it much more difficult to manage interest rates and inflation. Now, this comes, of course, off the back of people like Frank Calabria of Origin Energy saying, you know, guys, we have to have a really serious discussion about what we're doing. The one question, and I've been trying to get Labor to answer this really since the election campaign, that nobody seems to really want to have a talk about, and I think this is what Phillip Lowe and Frank Calabria do want to talk about, is where do all the electrons come from? Where does the electricity come from as you do this? You know, the CSIRO has said, I think it's something like $500 billion to get all of the renewable transmission out there in the countryside and everything else, all the problems that you get that because, of course, other countries are doing the same thing. No one's able to really answer where this is all going to go. The most we have is, well, we've got to try. And Lowe is, I think, right to bell the cat on this one, Peter.
What about Claire O'Neill? She's the Federal Minister for Home Affairs. There's been this issue about the Islamic State women returning to Australia with children. Still more to come. The bulk of them are headed to Western Sydney. We know they'll end up in Melbourne, but the Andrews government is dancing about that this side of the election. There's still been a reluctance by the minister to even have a face-to-face meeting. That's just got to be remedied, surely. I mean, she's frying on this issue. We know the mayors in Western Sydney are very angry, and it's a very potent issue in communities that Labor needs to hold if they want to hold on to power.
Well, I mean, it's a huge issue, Peter. You know, you think about Fairfield, which is, you know, the electorate or the area of Fairfield around there. There's a huge Assyrian community which is furious that that all of these ISIS people are being brought back, even contemplated being brought back. Now, that's in the heart of Chris Bowen's electorate, so it's a huge problem for Labor. Claire O'Neill, I believe now, is actually going to finally, after offering a virtual meeting, is going to finally meet with Di Lee, the independent member for Fowler. But this issue has, for the start, caused Labor a huge amount of trouble in Western Sydney, which, of course, they need and is supposedly Labor heartland, because an awful lot of the communities out there, they're here in Australia precisely because of people like ISIS, and they don't want to see, any sympathy accorded to people who, who turned their backs on Australia and also are in touch with or have any relation to the people who drove them out of their homelands in the Middle East. Huge problem for Labor, Peter.
You got to front the people. I mean, Phil Ruddock, if you remember, in the early part of the Howard years, when there was issues with the first round of boat arrivals, he would hold these enormous public meetings. I know because I worked for the Parliamentary Secretary to Phillip Ruddock at the time. And you'd go there, it'd be about 1,000 people, and he would deal with the issues of immigration head on. He'd bring the communities with him. They mightn't always agree with him, but they felt that they were listened to. I think this is a wrong move. I think this is partly why people have so many issues. Lack of trust, etc., with the governments they elect. That's come out in another survey today. They're saying that faith in government has declined. Trust in government was 54% in the pandemic. Now it's down to 44%. And again, last year it was 44%. This year it's down to 41%. It's on the slide. And one of the biggest issues concerning Australians is social cohesion, poverty, issues like that. It's not climate change anymore. It's much more kitchen table, I have to say.
Well, yeah, of course, it's always going to be kitchen table. I mean, coming out of the pandemic, when governments, I think, in many ways, took our trust and ultimately wound up violating it in Victoria, but also around the country with border closures, with lockdowns that went on far too long. We had that report the other day, the Shergold report on the lockdowns, which said, many of these were done for political purposes, not for reasons of science. People know that, and they know that their lives, their kids' education, their ability to farewell loved ones, all of these things were toyed with for political and not epidemiological purposes, and so they're rightly furious about it. But I mean, I think, as we get into a more economically straightened time, of course, there's going to be further concerns about these social cohesion issues. And part of that, of course, is always going to be that migration issue. The great compact of Australia is Australians are really, really welcoming, just to come back to the issue we were talking about of having a huge, large immigration intake, but they've got to feel like, they're being consulted on it, and that's not what's happening here. So that issue we were just talking about, I think, feeds directly into this sort of social cohesion worry. We also see it, with the way the government is, I think, pushing through a lot of legislation that does seem to be, about satisfying mates in unions or other areas, and and the results are clear, Peter.
And honeymoons end pretty quickly when they end. James Morrow, thank you.
Indeed.